Hi, everyone. Good afternoon to most of you. Good morning to a few of you from what I can see on time zones. Thank you all for joining us for a webinar really excited about. Today, we'll be talking through an important and timely topic. We've titled it Sexual Harassment at Work, Using Surveys to Assess the Risk and Support Meaningful Conversations When Sexual Harassment Occurs at Your Company. This is a really timely topic we're all hearing about and talking about quite a bit in our field. This will likely be the first of a few webinars we're going to host on this subject. We really want to start a meaningful discussion between people practicing in organizations and working on this subject and finding ways to improve the way organizations can use measurement to combat sexual harassment. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things. All of the attendees are going to be on mute for the presentation. So if you have any questions or thoughts that come to you during the presentation, please go ahead and enter those in the chat box on the GoToMeeting. We'll be monitoring that and we'll save at least 10 to 15 minutes to address those at the end. So we'd love to hear from you. Additionally, we will be sending out the slides to everyone. So don't worry about taking detailed notes. You'll get all of this. We'll also be recording. So if you'd like a recording of this at the end, please do let us know. And final piece of housekeeping, we are a survey company, so of course we are going to send you all a survey as you leave the webinar. Those surveys help us get feedback on the way we present these webinars, the content of the webinars, so we'd really love to hear from you so that we can continue to shape these and make these as useful to you as possible. So with all that housekeeping in mind, go ahead and get started. I'd like to start us out with a couple of intros. I'll get started since I'm already talking here. My name is Victoria Hendrickson. I'm a partner and vice president on the consulting side with OrgVitality. I have a background and PhD in organizational psychology from Alliant International University. And I work primarily in our survey practice with organizations really across industries. And I like to do research on topics of inclusion and diversity, actionable feedback, and innovative leadership. Really excited to present this today along with Sertrice. So Sertrice, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, yes. So I'm Sertrice Grice, and I have my master's in industrial organizational psychology from Radford University. And my personal interests include topics like motivation and engagement, and I have experience in survey development, focus groups, and of course project management, as I am a project manager at OrgVitality. So I'm excited as well to have this conversation.
Excellent. So let's go ahead and dive in. Sertrice and I will be tag teaming, going back and forth on some of these topics. And I'd like to start us off with an introduction to sexual harassment and how we're going to approach this as survey practitioners. So, we're here today because we know this is a real issue. So far, this is one of our most popular webinars of the year. Clearly, it's a timely issue that a lot of people want to talk more about and talk about how to address it. A lot of us are hearing anecdotes either personally or professionally about women being harassed in the workplace. Some people might have experienced it themselves, but no matter how you're hearing about it, I think it's safe to say we are all hearing and talking about it, whether it's in the news, locally, globally, and everywhere in between. We're hearing about it in politics, in Hollywood, or even competing organizations down the street. These stories of how women are being treated in less than respectful ways are certainly coming through. A few months ago, about 5 months ago, the Me Too movement took hold across the US. So we saw women across all walks of life begin to share their stories about sexual harassment. It started on social media, but it's really permeated through trusted social circles and all kinds of venues. Many of these women are sharing their stories for the first time and really demanding action be taken. At the time Me Too started, we believed about 1 in 3 American women felt it applied to them, though I'm going to share some other numbers that help put the issue of sexual harassment into context. And we can look at how this is occurring both in our culture and across the organizations we all work in. Broadly, across our American culture, we see 1 in 3 college-age women are sexually assaulted, which is a pretty staggering number when you think about the size and vulnerability of that population. And that, sort of early career age of women is particularly vulnerable. We also see that 1 in 3 women ages 18 to 24 are reporting being sexually harassed at work. So it's in those initial first stages of someone's career that they're often coming into these situations, and often at a time when they're less equipped to deal with this, or they don't know where to go. That number is going to double to 2 in 3 when you look across the course of a woman's career. And, I think it goes without saying that this is a horrific experience for someone to go through, but a lot of people are surprised by the implications and the outcomes that our organizations end up dealing with. One number that's surprised a couple of people I've spoken with is this one here. Each year, we see about 3,000 female STEM PhDs leave the workforce, stating reasons of harassment or gender discrimination in their workplace. And, that's not a big pool to start with. So 3,000 people in a really, high demand, highly technical, and highly educated workforce, I think shows some of this impact. Of course, that's not limited to STEM. Across industries, we see that 1 in 10 women that are harassed either, try to change their job or end up quitting due to the harassment. And so these are all really serious implications. It's an emotional and trying experience to the people who suffer, and we'd agree that even a single instance in an organization is too many, but it's also a cultural and systemic issue that's going to sweep across every context. So we're coming to a turning point where women are saying time is up and inaction is no longer a choice. So, given that, clearly we're in a position where we recognize this is a real issue, and practitioners are starting to talk about it and say, what can all of us do given our experience and our expertise? We're not here today to tell you that we've got a silver bullet and that we've got a survey that's going to give you the magic insight to solve the problem, because it is a real deep-seated social issue that's baked into our culture. It's going to take time to change on a systemic level. When we look at the research, we can see that past promises of new training or policy developments haven't yielded major changes in these kinds of behaviors. That research shows us that sexual harassment training, while it is necessary, doesn't prevent incidents. It's of course important to set rules and expectations, but what the research has found to differentiate organizations where sexual harassment happens less is actually having female or minority leadership at the very top levels. And so, I'd love to say it's because female leadership simply has something extra or has something different. But what I think this tells us is that it's less about training and rules, but it's more about leadership values and the culture that these minorities are promoting. So women and minorities in the research do tend to promote a more inclusive, trusting culture, potentially because of early experiences they've had and needed this kind of support. So all of this is to say is that culture is key with this. And this component of culture is where all of us on the phone come in today. We can use our measurement background and our survey practices to help identify areas of risk within our companies and to start the conversations that promote a healthy culture that are ultimately going to combat instances of sexual harassment. So today we're going to focus on how to do that specifically with employee surveys. And while we've got a lot of experienced survey practitioners on the phone, I think we can all recognize that surveys of this kind bring some different considerations, whether it's what questions to ask, how they're implemented, and how you handle those post-survey conversations. It's simply different than other survey topics. So our goal today is to frame up how to handle this and best support a healthy culture. To start that out, I want to hand it over to Sertrice. She's going to talk a little bit more about how we define it and go about the strategy of measuring this kind of risk.
Thanks, Victoria. So if you were to Google sexual harassment, what would come up in the results? Typically, when people think of sexual harassment, they think of a man saying inappropriate things to a woman. But what is sexual harassment? When thinking of sexual harassment definitions, you can usually group them into 3 different categories. The first category is legal. For the US, we have the legal definition by the EEOC. It's a rather long definition that not only defines sexual harassment and the various different circumstances that must be met for it to legally be considered harassment, but also the outcomes from it. The next is a more socio-psychological definition, which is more of the educational definition and focuses more on the victim's experience. And the last category is the layman's definition, and what everyday people think of when they say sexual harassment. A fair amount of research has been done on sexual harassment, but surprisingly, there is yet to be one unified definition. However, all definitions tend to agree that the behavior is prohibited, unwanted, and causes harm to the victim. In addition to the three categories above, definitions of sexual harassment are being broadened to include different combinations of gender identity and sexual preference as well. There are even more definitions out there still once you factor in global differences. Currently, about 50 countries prohibit sexual harassment, and sexual harassment definitions across those countries can be rather broad. For example, in Australia, sexual harassment includes not only incidents that happen in the workplace, but at company-sponsored social functions, work conferences, or at external premises with external vendors or clients as well. But then definitions can even be very narrow. So for example, in France, while sexual harassment is a criminal offense, it only includes coercion to obtain sexual favors. So when defining sexual harassment for your company, make sure to consider what your company does and the situations your employees may be in. So do employees spend time at external locations? Are you a multinational company with employees in countries that have different laws you may want to take into account, and so on? It's also important to account for company culture because studies have shown that company culture can override country culture, and it's a company's responsibility to build that culture that does not tolerate sexual harassment, not solely to rely on the laws of the countries. So although there may not be one unified definition for sexual harassment, today, when Victoria and I are discussing it, we're referring to unwanted sex-related behavior that causes physical or emotional harm to the victim, affecting their work life. We went with this definition because at OV, we're examining the issue from a researcher's perspective. We have experience conducting survey work in organizations across industries with varying size, gender balance, and history with sexual harassment. And based on that experience, we've come up with a few strategies on how to address sexual harassment in organizations. Today, we're going to review 7 steps for success when using surveys to help address sexual harassment at your company and building conversations around that. So when thinking of these strategies, it's important to first consider relevant constructs related to sexual harassment and society's effect. We've all heard the phrase, "she was asking for it." People succumb to the just world fallacy and think that people who were sexually harassed somehow deserved it. They want to believe that it will never happen to them or at their organization. But the truth is, no one deserves to be harassed, and anyone can be sexually harassed at any organization. And when it happens, there are 2 ways it can be handled. We hope that the incident will be reported. That way, the incident can be handled effectively. However, depending on the climate of the organization, this may not happen. People who report incidents may be seen as whistleblowers, and whistleblowers can be viewed negatively and even succumb to retaliation. Due to this concern, people may choose not to report. And people who witness instances of sexual harassment may also choose not to report due to the bystander effect and believing it's someone else's problem, or even worse, that nothing would happen if it was reported. So they take the safe route and keep their mouth shut. I also wanted to discuss the stereotype bias and stereotype threat. People tend to make sexual harassment a quote-unquote women's issue. Some people believe that only women are sexually harassed, therefore, it's a women's problem. However, it is not only a women's problem for multiple reasons. One being anyone can be sexually harassed by anyone in the workplace. So be it a man or woman being harassed by a man or woman or any other gender identity combination. Furthermore, cases of sexual harassment do not only affect the accuser, but the accused, their coworkers, and the entire organization. Which leads me to my last point here, which is workplace violence, because at its root, sexual harassment is a form of workplace violence and should be treated as such. There needs to be a clear policy of how to identify it and penalties for when it occurs. So how should you handle these possible issues? Well, it's important to create a culture of zero tolerance for sexual harassment at your company. And when developing surveys, you should make a point to add questions that address these constructs above to help you determine the likelihood that sexual harassment will occur in your company and on how the handling of those cases is being perceived by your employees. You should include questions related to topics such as trust, openness, and belonging. Building a culture based on trust helps victims feel comfortable reporting and gives them the confidence that the matter will be efficiently handled. Because the fact of the matter is, based on statistics like the ones Victoria mentioned earlier, we know that sexual harassment will occur in most organizations. So building this trusting environment is essential. Part of building that environment is developing efficient strategies to address issues retroactively and proactively as well. When thinking of sexual harassment and sexual harassment policies, organizations should consider 3 different strategy types. The first is primary, and primary prevention refers to activities which take place before any injustice has occurred to prevent any initial harm. Primary prevention strategies should have a few different key features. One, they should explain what constitutes as wrongdoings, so everyone knows what we're referencing when we say sexual harassment. And policies should be visible, so everyone is aware of what the policies are. They need to be effectively managed by anyone involved. Outline penalties that can occur after sexual harassment has happened, and be committed to broader gender equality goal. It is also important to train on these policies. And these education sessions should be conducted regularly and universally, not just at locations that may have issues with sexual harassment. It's actually best when they are part of onboarding because it helps embed the zero tolerance message into the company culture right from the start. And trainings should raise awareness and clarify misconceptions about what constitutes as sexual harassment. And there should also be specific trainings for managers because it is likely that victims may disclose to them. And managers should be trained on topics such as conflict management, managing of emotions, and facilitation techniques. Surveys can help with development of both the policies and trainings I mentioned. Both policies and trainings are more useful when they are developed from information gathered from organizational assessments. These surveys could help identify if people have an understanding of the policies, agree with the policies, and if they have that feeling of trust at the organization we discussed earlier. You can then use these results to start conversations at the organization around potential changes that need to be made to help with preventing future incidents. The next type of prevention strategy is secondary prevention. Secondary prevention incorporates immediate responses after the event has occurred. It's important that these strategies ensure appropriate manager responses to complaints. There should be multiple reporting channels, and investigations should be timely, and sanctions need to be applied when appropriate. Again, surveys can help identify the effectiveness of your secondary strategies. You can find out if people feeling incidents are being handled effectively, or perhaps if improvements can or should be made. Having this survey data helps build those conversations. And the last type of strategy I want to discuss on this slide is tertiary prevention. Tertiary refers to long-term response strategies, which aim to deal with any ongoing consequences of the problem. It is recommended to follow up with both the complainant and the respondent to ensure that retaliation had not occurred. It's important to survey employees on your tertiary strategy to see if employees are still feeling connected to the organization after an event or after an incident. Sexual harassment has been found to have an effect on job satisfaction, turnover, and other attributes. Having an effective follow-up method is key to how a person will feel after an event. Because each organization is unique, these prevention strategies must be custom designed rather than taking a one-size-fits-all approach. That is why it's important to survey on relevant constructs and your strategies. That way you can get the data you need to build conversations around your company's culture regarding sexual harassment. And Victoria is going to kind of take that and go one step further.
Perfect, thanks. So, based on the foundation Sertrice has talked through, we want to step back and look at how to find these issues in the survey. And I want to start this measurement part of our talk by saying, I'm sure a lot of this is not news to a lot of you on the phone. We've got a lot of experienced survey practitioners, and I'm sure you've all thought a lot about this. And I'm sure you've come to some of the same conclusions that we have. Frankly, it's not so easy to find these issues in the data, whether it's about what's already happening or finding areas of risk. Survey data in the aggregate can make it hard to find hotspots or areas where you're looking for a minority's experience in particular. So, let me give you an example of what this looks like. A recent client of ours came to us and said they wanted to focus more on this. And we said, tell us more. And they said they were hearing some really concerning stories about a quote unquote bro culture. Women were having a lot of trouble and coming forward with some disturbing stories. And frankly, this is pre-brotopia, but the situation is more prevalent now and certainly fits a lot of the characteristics that I think organizations are looking out for. And this is an organization that cares a lot about inclusion and diversity. They make a number of genuine efforts. Their leaders really say all the right things, seem to do the right things, and they have really high scores across the board. So when we look at their survey scores on items about inclusion and diversity, respect, career paths, you name it, the scores are really favorable. So we started to step back and say, all right, scores are high. We've got some terrible stories and anecdotes. How do you reconcile that? In different ways, they both reflect reality. So how can we find the pockets within this really positive organization in order to help those women who are having those experiences? When we dug in and had some conversations, it turned out that the women facing the issues or the quote unquote bro culture were embedded in mostly male teams. So if you look at manager group scores of where these women report, or if you cut any particular item by gender in an aggregate sense, the scores are still high. We don't have any issue really pop where we say, we've got to go fix that. So even if one woman is having a terrible experience that everyone wants to resolve, if the score is drowned out by a majority positive male scores, the risk just isn't going to pop. So in a way, the people who are most at risk, women and other kinds of minorities in fields dominated by men, are less likely to be heard through typical survey methods. So what does it mean? It means we need to approach the data differently than we do on other survey topics. Slicing and dicing our questions by gender or minority characteristics isn't going to work here, given that they are minorities and the proportion of responses makes it tough for that experience to really come through. So we need to step back and look at the questions we're asking of the data and the fields we have available. So based on the questions we're asking, we'll come up with a really specific analysis plan. It's going to impact the questions we ask on the survey, the data we want to look at, what kinds of comparison groups are meaningful, and what sort of analyses are going to bring out the insight that really tell a story of where there's risk and where we need to change. So, all that said, how do we actually do it? We're going to get into some step-by-step of how we form those plans in a moment, but first I want to look at a specific example from that client I was describing with that quote-unquote bro culture issue. So here we're going to look at a question that doesn't actually ask about sexual harassment. It doesn't even ask about inclusion. The question is, I'm confident that if I report any concerns, they will be addressed appropriately. And this is a question that, by the way, we've seen, pop in different ways with different kinds of gender interactions across industries. It's turned out to be a really powerful one for these kinds of investigations. But with this client, if we were to start with a simple gender cut, you can see the data on the screen here. It's really close. It's 2 points apart. So at a company-wide level, with a high N size, we might as well call this the same, essentially. And frankly, they're not just the same, but they're pretty high scores. So if we were to stop here, we would say, you know what? Looking good. Everybody can report concerns. But we went a step further and we said, all right, things tend to be a little different in client-facing groups compared to the groups who are a little more internally focused. So same thing here. If we just look at client facing versus not client facing, we see high scores that are almost exactly the same, very comparable. We might continue on our way. But from what we know about the experiences women were facing specific to externally facing groups, we looked at an interaction of what about client-facing men compared to client-facing women. Here's where we really saw the scores start to come apart. Here we can see more than a 15-point gap, and that's where we start to say, all right, this is a qualitatively different experience that women are having compared to men. There is something much different about how they feel their concerns will be addressed. And so what we did here is say, all right, why is that? What is the experience? And we started to look at some comments. What are people describing about their concerns? And for our leadership presentation, we actually paired this graph with the comment here from one of those client-facing women, where she described in depth that leaders really say all the right things, want to create an inclusive culture, but getting the job done in these externally facing groups is really reflective of some gendered past experiences. They're required to go to all these sports games and fishing weekends and club nights, and these are the kinds of things that start to stack up in that bro culture experience that we were hearing about. So all in all, what did this combination of data do for us? It created a clear picture of where the issues are happening, what's the group that needs some additional support and intervention, and what's a description of the issues. The scores alone tell us they're a different experience, but by layering in those individual comments, we were able to give leaders a really rich description of how people feel. And that gut, how people feel, really changed leaders' I think perception of how urgent this was and how they needed to get involved. So, I hope this example gives a sense of how to dig in with some depth to really find the pockets of risk. From here, I want to step back and look at the process of how we got there. What are the steps all of you on the phone can take to uncover a similar pocket of risk in your organization and really bring it to life? I want to start with 3 steps here. Really, when we're looking at this kind of analysis, and really when we're looking to find a pocket of risk inside an otherwise very healthy, positively scoring organization, we're really trying to piece the puzzle together and find a nuanced story. So the questions we start by asking ourselves are on the screen here. The first one is of direction. Are we looking forwards or back? There's a choice of, do you want to predict areas of risk based on some associated factors, or do you want to ask really directly about what's happened? The second consideration is the depth of your analysis. And here it can be a combination of looking broadly across the climate, like a business unit or geography, or going really deep where the risk factors are especially high, like that example of client-facing women, or an area where historically women have been a minority, like in certain areas of engineering. And then going along with that, the third consideration is, who are your high quality informants? Whose opinions matter most on these questions? We looked earlier at comparing broad gender cuts to more specific ones, and this is an instance where your analysis approach is going to be a little different than the rest of your surveys. Averaging scores isn't going to do you any favors and help those risk factors pop, but weighting scores of minorities or specific populations of interest might help and make some different sense here. So, thinking about that a little more deeply, I want to break each one of these down. And the first one will be that direction piece. So again, here's where we're asking, do we want to look forwards or back? And this comes most into play when you're writing your survey questions. So if you're really concerned about specific incidents, maybe you've heard about a bro culture, or you've heard about a particular location where sexual harassment is a real concern, you might want to ask people directly if they've been harassed or treated with disrespect. And here's where you would get really specific with behavioral questions of, has X happened to you, or have you observed it? Now, that said, there is research that these kind of incidents are underreported for all of the reasons Sertrice mentioned in the beginning here. There's stigma associated with handling this, and it's really tough for people to admit that some of these things have happened to them. So, here's where you've got a choice. Asking directly about the behavior is certainly the most valid way to ask the question, but in some organizational cultures, it might make people uncomfortable. And if people are uncomfortable or unwilling to answer the question and you don't get sufficient data, that's not going to help you get any insight. Doesn't matter how great the survey question was. So given that, we also suggest asking questions in a more proactive way that's going to measure some aspects of the supportive culture that Sertrice mentioned, looking at trusting behaviors, looking at openness and belongingness, and assessing those areas for where you might be at more risk. We can combine those proactive, culture-oriented questions and analyze them by some meaningful data cuts to predict where incidents can occur or where the culture simply needs an additional amount of support in order to combat sexual harassment. So those questions are often around whether people feel they can speak up and raise concerns, whether they feel respected at work, and one of my favorites is whether people feel like others like them are valued in the organization. That can be a really telling one. So once we've got that, we move on to the last piece here where we want to look at those topics in particular populations. Generally, we want to begin broadly to assess the climate and then delve in deeper to particular informant populations. So often when we look at these items by population of risk, we can see where you need some help. You might ask where we decide those populations of risk are. Often we start with the research and then we go into, what are you hearing about in your company? Because of course we can start with the research, but it's all going to be very specific to your organizational culture and history. So, starting with the research, some of those pockets of risk are women in majority male teams. So you might look at teams with ratios of, mostly male to female. Also women in client-facing or external teams can be an area of risk. And those are important ones to look at. We'll look at a couple of others in a few slides. But historically, these are areas that across industry, sexual harassment is simply higher. So it makes sense to start looking here. And so, when you have this, three-step approach, this can help you ask the right set of questions, find some areas of concern. Maybe you find some particular areas of unfavorable scores on being respected or feeling you belong. And so the next steps are really about conveying them in a compelling way that illustrates the issue and helps leaders see what they need to act on. And so the next slides here are going to be about how we want to characterize those issues. Our goal is to take the data and clearly describe what's happening so that we can move forward. There are almost never arguments that people should be treated with respect or that everyone should be included, but it's often hard to characterize those experiences when they often are in pockets, they are stigmatized, and they are small. So you're often looking at a score that in comparison to others isn't that low, but symbolically, any score of less than 100% is worth working on. It's a different way of framing those up for your leaders. So, sometimes without a great deal of description or context, the data on these issues do lose a sense of urgency, and the numbers alone are unlikely to tell the real story. So here, we really want to consider the unique dynamics of where sexual harassment occurs. We can draw out the story. We can also combine unique dynamics of individual and aggregate levels of scores, kind of like we did with that client example before. So here, this is where you've done your data analysis, but the magic is in combining your data, research from across industries of where this happens and what to do, and some historical treatments of groups can be especially powerful. So we'll look here at another three-step of how we might do that with our data. Similar to the way we had those 3 steps to create an analysis plan, we want to have a similar set of 3 steps to create a compelling story that's going to convey the data and create a burning platform for change, show your leaders why they need to act rather than just telling them it's something important to take a look at. And so the first step we want to look at here is varying levels of data. So we've talked earlier about company level versus team level and individual. Here we want to look at how do we best integrate those. Often I might start with the company or business-wide level to get a sense of the broad climate. What are strengths? What are opportunities in an aggregate sense? Once we have an idea of what those might be, we can dive into those specific pockets, whether they are demographics or hierarchy based. We can see where those differences are becoming more pronounced. And even if those scores are still high, where do they really start to stray from that aggregate group? And we can see where is that culture most different from the company overall. And then once it's clear where it's happening, we might also integrate some of the individual level data. So, certainly staying within our minimum N and confidentiality, we want to bring in some comments, kind of like the one we showed in that client example. Those representative comments can show what the group level scores are really signaling. Once we know there's a difference, how can we really bring it to life for leaders, what it feels like, or what people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis? Second step is to identify the specific story or experience we want to tell. And as we saw on the previous slide, these can get really nuanced. So rather than just cutting individual items by gender, we're often going to find that story at the intersection of related topics and segments of employees. So, some of the segments are going to be, those that have a history of being underrepresented or a history of being treated with discrimination, whether in your organization or just broadly out in the world, because we know these things do permeate, through organizations. So, some of the ones that we start with are women in historically male-dominated functions. So, women in engineering is certainly a big one that a lot of people are looking at. How are their experiences different than men in engineering, or even different than women in more female-based groups like HR? Those can be quite telling. And, I say to consider the history because, women in engineering will certainly be quite different than women in nursing, for example, where, women in nursing are certainly not a minority and simply have a different experience and different history in the workplace. So some of those hotspots, will also include early career women. They can be more vulnerable, since we've seen from some of the statistics, and they'll have less experience in how to deal with some of these things. Externally facing women is another, women in majority male groups, and women reporting to men. So this is a really long list of groups you might start with. You might narrow in, given your company and your focus. So, I'd suggest giving a look at your organizational structure, your industry's history with things like gender balance and sexual harassment, and, your own company's history and approach to dealing with this. There might be particularly meaningful groups to start with or to look at based on this, and also the anecdotes you've heard of where things might be occurring. Once you've got those populations, you can then look at the items that tend to differentiate the cultures that combat sexual harassment and those who enable it. So we've got a couple of examples here. Respectful treatment is certainly one. Also a sense of whether people feel valued, feel included, and feel like they can be their full self at work tend to be quite telling. So wrapping this all together, we want to bring it back to our client example. You can see how we went past those standard cuts of male and female to look for the interaction. Here, we knew that there was something different about the experience of externally facing women and this issue of being able to speak up. That finding on its own didn't really tell us what we need to do or what we need to change, but those comments described why women feel their issues weren't being addressed and why they didn't feel heard, and it gave us a clear story of what we needed to do. So, from here, from telling the data story, we want to go to the next part of the survey rollout, and that's what happens when you get the scores back. So, this post-survey stage is going to require different kinds of considerations given the emotions and, attachments that come with these kind of conversations. The quote here up on the slide is from the APA. So, just to read it all out loud, sexual harassment is typically not an accidental occupational problem, but it involves intentionality. So to me, this characterizes why this topic is so different than other items on your survey. A negative score or experience on this kind of topic is not about an old machine that causes workflow frustrations or a miscommunication that led to some extra work, but it means someone intentionally treated another employee in a dehumanizing and demoralizing manner. So these discussions are going to get really personal and emotional, and they should. The goal is not to back away from that. The goal here is to rather to be prepared for it. So when you get these scores back, there will be a question of what are managers supposed to do with it? What's their assignment with it? And the assignment attached to the results might be really similar to other surveys. Take your scores, have a discussion, decide what to work on, but it's going to be quite different. It will be emotional for men and women, whether they're affected or not, and you just have to be ready for that. So my advice here is to overplan. Your managers are going to be your first responders. And in these conversations, employees are going to describe some interactions they've either heard about, observed, or experienced. So make sure your managers are ready to support those employees and report the feedback up through the chain. When they report that feedback, your centralized groups also need to be ready to respond with the appropriate investigations, sanctions, and ongoing employee support. And that really takes us to leadership. Managers might be your first responders, but your leaders are really the ones to set the tone. It's important that sexual harassment or inclusion initiatives aren't viewed as just another HR project, but integral to how your company operates and really what you stand for. And the survey can be helpful in this. If you want your leaders to speak up about these issues as often and as passionately as they might discuss direction, sales figures, or even safety records, you need to arm them with the data to do that. Most leaders we meet with are really happy to do it. They care about their employees. They want people to be treated with respect, but they're simply not aware of a lot of the day-to-day because of their role, or they might not have the data to speak from. So use your survey as a way to give them the data they need to speak to this. You can connect them to the reality of what people are experiencing and give them an idea of where to focus. So whether it's flagging those hotspots, give them a couple of comments that really describe the experience, or show them year-to-year trends on how things are changing. They'll be able to get out in front of these issues in a different way. And finally, if we're talking about everyone's role in this, there's the role of ally. And that's a role for every single person in your organization. Want to repeat Sertrice's earlier point that sexual harassment is not a women's problem. As many brilliant women have already said, if this were a women's problem, we would have long ago solved this. The key to addressing it and to doing something different is to involve everyone in the conversation and involve everyone in the change. And I think the survey is a really great way to build a culture of allies. One way you can navigate those difficult pulse survey conversations is to put the scores down and talk about behaviors. Talk about not just what's happened, who said what, or what is the definition, but talk about what's every employee's role in creating and supporting a culture of respect and inclusion. One item I really like to put on surveys is, I know what I can do to support an inclusive environment. And as a lot of you might guess, the scores come back really high. It's an I know, it's a my actions kind of item. So, people tend to rate it really positively. So it's not that helpful in a diagnostic sense, but it's invaluable in creating team conversations about what each person's role is and getting a commitment from each person that they're going to go do those things and do what they can to create an inclusive environment. So again, advice here is to use the survey to create those conversations to get every employee's commitment to calling out harassment or bad behavior and speaking out when it does happen. And we're going to talk about why these allies speaking out are so critical, because statistically speaking, this will happen in organizations. So I'll pass to Sertrice for those next steps on when it does happen.
Yeah, to wrap up, we wanted to discuss what to do after an incident happens. So an incident happened, and as Victoria just said, statistically speaking, it will happen in your company. There are a few key things to keep in mind. First, we wanted to go back to those support networks. Employees' attitudes and experience of sexual harassment are derived from both organizational and individual factors. In addition to the policies in play, employees' experience will be affected by how the manager or whoever they disclose to the incident to reacts. So it's vital to provide strong support networks. When sexual harassment occurs, it impacts the victim's job satisfaction, work productivity, health conditions, and even psychological conditions. Therefore, this so-called individual level problem can have an effect on the organization as a whole. To help minimize these negative side effects, it is important that an organization builds a climate of zero tolerance for sexual harassment and that trusting environment we've been discussing, where victims and witnesses can feel comfortable reporting any transgressions they have experienced. Part of that environment is having strong networks to support them through this process, be that the manager they reported to, a friend that can be an ally, or any other person connected to the situation. Next, I wanted to touch on those prevention strategies again that we discussed earlier. Now that an incident has occurred, it's important to utilize the secondary and eventually tertiary strategies that are in place. Make sure that the investigation is handled in a timely and confidential manner and that sanctions are given when appropriate. And of course, make sure you follow up after the investigation with both the accused and the accuser to see that they're still feeling as though they are a part of the company and that their experience hasn't changed and that there hasn't been any retaliation. Lastly, touching base one more time on leadership support. It's imperative that sexual harassment be addressed from the top down. It needs to be a part of company culture and have support from the leaders of the organization. And when incidents happen, leaders need to uniformly support the process that is in place. So now Victoria and I wanted to take a second to kind of summarize what we've been talking about over the past hour. So first, it's important to measure the right things. Asking survey questions related to relevant constructs such as trust and openness and the other example items that Victoria mentioned can help you determine your company culture and if your company culture has a zero tolerance for sexual harassment. Next, begin proactively. Because we know sexual harassment happens, it is best to work under the assumption that it will happen at your company. This means proactively working on your policies and culture around sexual harassment.
And when you begin your survey project or your measurement approach to this, start with the end in mind. Make sure you have the right data to characterize the issues and the risk factors. This is both in terms of the questions you ask of your employees and your analysis plan of how you want to get the insight. And that leads into telling a clear story with the data. If you've gotten there through a detailed and nuanced analysis plan, you're going to need to characterize the issue or experience in a way that shows the urgency and the need for intervention in a way that your leaders can quickly identify with and understand. And that urgency you find in the data can lead to some really delicate conversations. No doubt these conversations need to happen. We don't want you to shy away from them, but be sure that the organization is prepared to support them and be ready to support employees who do come forward. And leaders are going to have a really critical role in all of this, from setting the values and expectations at the very beginning to walking the talk and sticking with those values when things get hard. When you do find a pocket of risk, when you do find someone who's done something terrible, you need to make sure that we do follow up and say we would do what we said in the beginning. So you can be an invaluable partner by providing the data to describe these issues and help leaders walk the talk. And finally, we want to use the survey to encourage ally behavior that ultimately creates a supportive culture. It's everyone's responsibility, and this is a great way to remind them on an ongoing basis they all have a role in making it a great organization for everyone. So, stepping back, these are, things we've been talking about in depth, and they can take a lot of time to set up, and we want to be cognizant of that. Setting up the right measurement strategy and getting your leaders involved is not an overnight kind of activity. So while these are all things to start thinking about and putting in place, we also realize some of you might be fired up and ready to go do something today. So we want to give you a handful of ideas of a couple of things you can just walk away after this webinar and go do. And the first one is about finding out the needs in your organization. So set up a coffee chat with your diversity council or your head of inclusion, whoever the internal expert on this is. Go talk with them. They know the issues, you've got the data. Find out how you can partner. Find out what kind of data would help them run their programs more effectively or help them do a better job. And some of you will already have survey data and say, all right, I know what questions I might ask next time, but what can I do now? If your survey doesn't come around for another year, what can you do with what you already have? And there are some analyses you can do with what you've got. We like to do some segmentation kinds of analyses to find where those pockets of risk might be. We mentioned some examples during the webinar today, but you'd be best served to find where those pockets of risk specific to your organization are. Again, we like segmentation and tree analyses to do that. CHADE is really helpful to uncover the specific interactions where people are answering questions most differently. So for example, finding that combination of externally facing women could come from something like a CHADE. Another route, if you've already got your survey, is comments. So, generally we're reading through comments to find ideas for improvement or, very specific things we need to follow up on, but you might scan with a different eye, scan for themes of concerning experiences. And, these might not hit the radar for employee relations to go do an investigation, but if you start to see themes, they might help you see what you would ask differently on your next survey, or what kinds of post-survey conversations would move things forward in a different way. And then finally, on more of the post-survey end, want to think about that piece of, is the organization ready for these conversations? So I'm sure you all have a couple of trusted frontline manager buddies in the company. Find them, take them to coffee too. Ask them how they would handle this kind of conversation. Would they be ready for holding a conversation about sexual harassment with their team? Would they be ready for someone to disclose? If not, what do they need? That can help you plan those rollouts a little differently. So, any one of these or combination would get you started in a direction of finding the pockets of risk, creating the insight you need to address them. I do want to say they're just a starter. Sertrice and I are both happy to chat with any one of you and brainstorm some ideas of what you can do in your company. But for now, we do want to step back from this, take a couple of questions, and we'll go from there. So again, you are all on mute. So if you go to the GoToMeeting application and go to the chat box, please type in any questions you've got, and we'll spend the next 7 or so minutes here answering those and how you can address this specifically in your company. And it looks like we already have one. It might have come in a few minutes ago. And this has to do with global organizations. Looks like a lot of you are from global companies. So the question is, if we are a multinational company, should we impose one country's values or laws over another to define sexual harassment? Sertrice, I think this one's more in your expertise. Do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So I know I discussed multinational companies a little earlier when we were giving some background. And your company policy should be a reflection of your company culture. So more than likely, it's going to combine values from different countries. Your company should work to have a culture that represents its own values. So, yeah.
Got another one here about industries. So the question is, are some industries more prone to sexual harassment than others, and why?
Oh, that is a good one. Actually, so looking at research, if you look at the number of reported incidents from it's 2005 to 15, it was the accommodation and food service industry that had the highest percentage of sexual harassment claims filed to the EEOC, and retail industry was right behind that. However, even though it may appear that certain industries may have higher report rates, it may not mean that incidents are more likely to occur in those fields because, as we discussed earlier, sexual harassment has repeatedly been found to go underreported. And even if an industry does have a small amount of cases, it's still important to just address each one with urgency and to discuss sexual harassment as a part of your company culture, because even one case is too many.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Hard to know.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Let's see here. We've got one in particular about the survey and how to use a survey to find these issues. So let's see, this person's asked, is it better to address sexual harassment in an existing survey or in its own survey? So I think the question here is, if you're not already measuring sexual harassment and you'd like to, should you add it to what you're already doing, your current effort, or should it be its own effort entirely? This one might be an it depends. I know, surprising. But my initial reaction here is going back to one of those survey design questions we looked at of direction. And if you're asking people very specifically, have these behaviors happen to you or have you observed these behaviors? Or if you're going in more of a culture measurement and looking at areas of respect and inclusion and belongingness. And to me, that direction matters because I think it's going to change how a respondent really reacts to the survey. If we're asking in terms of the culture and things we know are associated with sexual harassment, I think that can be just fine on an existing survey. In fact, it might already be on parts of your existing survey. But essentially, people are going to answer those questions with similar levels of emotionality and attachment to the organization as others. However, if you are asking, have you been sexually harassed? Has someone said X to you? Has someone touched you inappropriately? I do believe that brings a different level of emotionality to how someone is going to respond to the survey. And that could then impact how they respond to other survey questions. And so, I see it better to separate something like that so that we're not contaminating, unrelated things with that emotionality with this more direct sexual harassment questions. I also think the way you would roll out reporting in those surveys would be quite different. So having a more focused look, if it is those very specific direct questions, would be good. That said, Sertrice, anything to add there or any different takes from your end?
No, yeah, those are the same points that came to mind when I heard the question as well. Is it just kind of depends on the route that you want to take, and I feel like it depends is always the answer in our field, isn't it?
Psychologists and consultants, we get to say it depends a lot. All right, let's see. Those are the questions we have time for. Certainly, if you continue to type those questions into the chat box, we're happy to follow up with you one-on-one. And also through the survey at the very end of this. From here, we just want to let you know about a couple of events coming up within OV. This slide contains a little bit of information about OrgVitality and the kinds of things we do. Today, we were talking very specifically about sexual harassment in employee surveys. Really our business is about taking the science between IO and employee research and deploying it through our proprietary technology. And that's often in strategic employee surveys, linkage research, things like that. We also get into 360s and different kinds of competency models, all here on the page. So certainly if you have any needs, we'd be happy to talk to you about that. And then we also want to mention we have an event coming up. We're really excited to support Psychology Day at the UN. We've done this for a few years. This year it'll be Thursday, April 12th. We will be hosting a group to attend a session. This year it's about climate change and psychological interventions that promote mitigation. We'd love to have you there. Attendees will learn about all the ways that this psychological theory and research can help protect people throughout the world. And then following the session, we'll have a reception and again, we'd love to have any one of you with us. We will need RSVPs in the coming days, so at the end of the webinar, if you're interested in joining us, please do let us know. Following the session, we'll be following up with each one of you individually with the slides. We'd love to connect with any of you to get your reactions to today. From here, Sertrice, I'd love to give you the final word if you've got any closing thoughts for our attendees.
I would just say that we know sexual harassment can be an intimidating topic. Gathering relevant data from your survey can really help make that conversation easier. And if you want any further help with that, feel free to reach out to Victoria and myself.
Excellent. Thanks. Thank you all for attending. Have a great day.